woman spends 50 years devoted to the love of her life, believing she knows everything about the man she married, but just before he takes his last breath, he utters a single name that she has never heard before, a name that will change everything. What happens when the truth unravels and a lifetime of trust is shattered in an instant? Let us know in the comments section below. Walter Jones had always been a man of quiet strength. Even in his final days, as the weight of age and illness bore down on him, he still carried himself with dignity. His hands, once steady and strong, now trembled slightly as Madison held them. The calluses softened but still visible, remnants of a lifetime spent working, building, providing. Madison sat beside his hospital bed, her fingers wrapped around his as she watched the rise and fall of his chest. She had been there for every part of his life, the triumphs, the struggles, the days of laughter, and the nights of quiet companionship. They had built a life together, raised a daughter, created a home filled with memories. Through it all, Walter had been her rock. Now, that rock was crumbling. The beeping of the machines filled the sterile hospital room, a stark contrast to the warmth of the man lying in the bed. Madison wanted to be strong for him, the way he had always been strong for her. But her heart ached, knowing this was the end. Walter's eyes fluttered open, his gaze unfocused at first before they settled on her. His lips parted, and she leaned in, desperate to hold on to every last word, every last moment. Then he whispered it. Hana. Madison blinked, her brows furrowed slightly, her lips parting in confusion. She searched his tired eyes, waiting for an explanation, but there was none. The name lingered in the air, like an unwelcome intruder in the space between them. Hana, she repeated softly, her voice barely above a whisper. Walter's lips trembled as if he wanted to say more, but the effort was too much. His breathing grew shallower, his grip on her hand weaker. The machines beeped erratically. And then, silence. A stillness settled over the room, a heaviness so suffocating that Madison felt like she couldn't breathe. Walter was gone. She sat there, frozen, staring at the man she had spent her entire life with, the love of her life, the father of her child, and yet, in his final moment, with his last breath, he had spoken another woman's name. Tears blurred her vision, but they weren't just from grief. They were from something deeper, something that clawed at the back of her mind and wrapped itself around her heart. It was Hana. The funeral came and went in a blur. Friends and family filled the house, offering condolences, sharing stories of Walter's life. Their daughter Emily stayed close to her, holding her hand, whispering reassurances that Madison could barely process. But through it all, that name haunted her. She tried to push it away, to convince herself it was nothing, a slip of the tongue, a name from a dream, a piece of a forgotten memory surfacing in his final moments. But the doubt gnawed at her, relentless and unyielding. 3 days after the funeral, as the house fell into an unfamiliar silence, Madison found herself drawn to the attic. Walter had always been the one to store things away, old photographs, letters, keepsakes from their past. She climbed the creaky stairs, her hands trembling as she reached for the string that pulled the light on. Dust swirled in the dim glow, settling over boxes labeled with years and places. Madison ran her fingers over the cardboard, feeling the weight of decades pressed down on her. She opened one box, then another. Photographs of their early years together, letters he had written her during his time in the service, old anniversary cards. But none of it answered the question burning in her mind. Then, in the farthest corner of the attic, she saw it. A wooden box, different from the others. It was small, with a delicate gold clasp, its surface worn but well kept, almost as if it had been handled with care, preserved. Her pulse quickened. She pulled the box closer, her fingers hesitant as she undid the clasp. The lid creaked open, revealing a stack of aged letters, their edges yellowed with time. Her breath caught. The handwriting on the envelopes was unmistakably Walter's. but they weren't addressed to her. Madison's hands trembled as she lifted the top letter, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear it in her ears. She turned it over. The name on the front made her stomach drop. Hana Nguyen. She felt as though the air had been stolen from the room. The letters slipped from her hands, scattering onto the attic floor. Walter had been writing to someone else. Someone she had never known. Someone he had taken to his grave. Her mind raced with questions, but one echoed louder than all the rest. Who was Hana, and why had Walter never told her about her? The search was slow, frustrating. Days turned into weeks as Madison and Emily scoured records, making calls, digging through military archives. But the name Hana Nguyen was as common as Smith in the U.S. Every lead turns into a dead end, Emily sighed one afternoon, rubbing her temples as she sat across from Madison at the kitchen table. Her laptop screen was filled with old photographs of Vietnam, blurry census records, and message boards where people searched for lost wartime connections. If she left Vietnam, she might have changed her name, or she might not have survived at all. Madison flinched at the thought. She didn't know this woman, but the idea of her dying alone, wondering what had happened to Walter, made her heart ache. She pushed away from the table. There has to be something we're missing. Emily hesitated, then glanced toward the box of letters. Dad must have known where to send them. Maybe he had an address. Madison's hands shook as she reached for the very bottom of the pile, sifting through letters until she found the oldest one. The first. There. A small slip of paper folded neatly inside. Madison opened it, her breath catching as she scanned the delicate, faded writing. Hana Nguyen, 38 Rue de Rose, Saigon, Vietnam. Madison and Emily exchanged a look. Emily grabbed her laptop, typing furiously. Saigon is Ho Chi Minh City now, but let me check if that street still exists. Madison held her breath as Emily scrolled, scanning maps and records. Then Emily's eyes widened. It's still there, she whispered. The street. It still exists. Madison's pulse thundered in her ears. Emily turned the screen toward her mother, pointing to a faded, outdated listing. Mom, there's still a house at that address. Madison felt her hands grow cold. What if she's still there? The letters lay scattered around Madison, their yellowed pages fragile against the attic's dusty floor. Her hands shook as she reached for one, forcing herself to take a steadying breath before unfolding the delicate paper. Walter's handwriting stared back at her, each curve of ink painfully familiar, yet carrying words meant for a stranger. Hana, I pray this letter finds you. I don't know if you are safe. I don't even know if you are alive. They pulled me out so fast I never got to say goodbye. I searched for you in the chaos, but there was nothing I could do. If you receive this, please write me back. Please, Hana, I need to know if you're out there. Madison's fingers clenched the paper, her heart pounding against her ribs. There were more letters, dozens. She reached for another. Hana, I sent 3 letters and still no word from you. I refuse to believe you're gone. I keep dreaming about you, about that last night together when I promised I'd take you away from the war. I should have never left you behind. I hate myself for it. Please, if you can, find a way to write back. I will wait for you, no matter how long it takes. The ink smudged slightly near the bottom as if Walter had run his fingers over the words again and again. Madison felt sick. This wasn't just a wartime friendship. Walter had loved this woman. Desperately. How had he never spoken of her? Not once in 50 years. Tears burned Madison's eyes, but she forced them back. She needed answers. With a shaking breath, she gathered the letters, pressing them to her chest as she made her way down from the attic. Emily was in the kitchen when Madison entered, her face still weary from grief. "Mom?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the box in Madison's hands. "What's that?" Madison sat down, placing the letters carefully on the table. "I need you to help me find someone," she said, voice tight. Emily hesitated. Who? Madison pushed the top letter toward her daughter, watching as Emily's brows furrowed while she read. A long silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Emily looked up. Who is Hana Nguyen? Madison swallowed hard. I don't know. But she meant something to your father, and I need to find out why. Emily was quiet for a long moment, her fingers ghosting over the worn pages of the letters. These are from Vietnam? Madison nodded. He must have met her during the war. Emmeline frowned, flipping through another letter. But these were never sent. Madison's stomach clenched. What? Emily held up an envelope. They all have Dad's handwriting, but there aren't any postal marks. No stamps. He never mailed them. Madison felt the weight of those words settle deep inside her. Walter had written all these letters, poured his heart into them, but for some reason he had kept them locked away, hidden from sight. What had stopped him from sending them? Had he ever tried to find her? Emily inhaled sharply. Mom, what if she was pregnant? Madison's head snapped up, her breath catching in her throat. It was a possibility she hadn't considered, but now, as she looked at the desperate, pleading words in Walter's letters, she knew Emily might be right. A part of her didn't want to know the answer, but another part of her knew she had no choice. She had to find Hana Nguyen. 2 weeks later, Madison stood in front of an old wooden house in the heart of Ho Chi Minh City, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The journey here had been overwhelming, flights, translators, piecing together the right documents, but now, standing on the doorstep, she felt frozen. What if this was a mistake? What if Hana had long since moved? What if she opened this door and had no idea who Walter was? She almost turned back, but then the door creaked open. A woman stood there. She was old, probably in her late 70s, but her eyes were sharp, dark, filled with a quiet strength. Madison swallowed hard. Hana? The woman frowned slightly, studying her. Yes? Madison's breath shuddered. She hadn't planned what to say, how to begin, but now, standing in front of this woman, the woman Walter had loved, she had no choice. My name is Madison Jones, she said quietly. I was married to Walter Jones. Hana's face remained unreadable, but something flickered in her eyes at the name. Madison reached into her bag, pulling out one of Walter's old letters. Carefully, she held it out. He wrote to you, she whispered. He never stopped. For a long moment, Hana didn't move. Then her hands, weathered with age, slowly reached for the letter. Her fingers traced the familiar handwriting. And then her lips parted. A single breath, a whisper. Walter. Tears welled in her eyes, and Madison knew in that moment that she had found the truth. But what came next? She wasn't sure she was ready to hear. Hana's hands trembled as she held the letter. Her eyes, clouded with age but still sharp with memory, traced Walter's handwriting, her breath shallow. Madison stood frozen, watching the emotions play out on the woman's face. Shock, disbelief, pain. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The world outside continued as usual, the distant hum of motorbikes, the faint sound of voices from the street. But here, in the small, time-worn house, it was as if the past had come rushing back all at once. Finally, Hana inhaled deeply, her grip tightening on the letter. She looked up at Madison, her voice barely above a whisper. He never stopped writing. Madison nodded slowly, feeling a lump form in her throat. No, he kept them all. He never sent them, but he never stopped. A tear slipped down Hana's cheek, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. For decades she had lived believing Walter had forgotten her, that the war had erased whatever they had shared. But now, in her trembling hands, was proof that he had tried. That he had never let go. Hana motioned for Madison to step inside. The house was modest, filled with relics of another time. The walls held faded photographs, books stacked in neat piles, the air carrying the scent of aged wood and jasmine tea. Madison sat at a small wooden table as Hana carefully unfolded the letter, reading each word as though it were a prayer. "He loved you," Madison said softly, breaking the silence. Hana's lips pressed together. "I loved him too," she whispered. A deep sorrow settled between them, a sorrow not of anger or resentment, but of time, of the lost years, the what-ifs, the unanswered questions. Madison hesitated before asking the one question she had been terrified to say aloud. Did you ever try to find him?" Hana let out a shuddering breath, setting the letter down carefully before looking at Madison with tired eyes. "Yes." Madison's stomach clenched. She wasn't sure if she wanted to hear what came next. "I wrote to him," Hana continued, her voice shaking. "After the war, when I had our son." Madison's breath caught. "Our son." The words struck her like a hammer, but she forced herself to stay still, to listen. "I sent letters to his unit, to the address he had given me before he left," Hana went on. "But I never received anything in return. I didn't know if he was dead or if he had moved on. But I had to try." Her voice wavered, but she kept going. "When the war ended, everything changed. Saigon fell. My letters were likely never sent, or, if they were, they never reached him. I waited. And when I realized I had no choice, I raised our son alone. A son. Walter had a son." Madison pressed a hand to her chest, her heart racing. After all these years, she had lived believing she knew everything about Walter, their life together, and now, sitting across from her, was the truth. A truth he had never known. "What's his name?" Madison asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Hana's lips trembled as she spoke. "Daniel." The name hung between them, heavy and real. "He's in America now." Hana added softly, "He moved there years ago. He never stopped wondering about his father." Madison could barely process the weight of the moment. Walter had a son he never met. A son who had spent his life searching for the man who had unknowingly spent his life waiting for him. She swallowed hard, steadying her breath. "I need to find him." Hana's eyes glistened with something unreadable. Do you think he would want to know?" Madison hesitated, then nodded. "He deserves to know the truth." Hana closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing herself for something she had never allowed herself to hope for. Then she reached for an old, creased piece of paper and carefully wrote down an address. "He lives here now?" she said, sliding the paper toward Madison. Madison stared at it, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The plane ride home felt like a dream. Madison sat in silence, the piece of paper clutched tightly in her lap, her mind a whirlwind of emotions. Emily met her at the airport, concern etched into her face the moment she saw her mother. "Did you find anything?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. Madison nodded, the weight of her discovery still pressing down on her. "Yes," she whispered. "I found her." Emily's eyes widened, but before she could speak, Madison exhaled shakily. "And I found out that Walter had a son." Emily staggered back slightly, as if the words had physically hit her. "A son." Madison nodded again, pulling out the slip of paper with the address. "His name is Daniel. He lives in California." Emily took a deep breath, running a hand through her hair. "Dad had a son," she murmured, shaking her head as if trying to grasp the reality of it. Then, looking at Madison, she asked, "What do we do now?" Madison knew the answer, even if it terrified her. "We go see him." Daniel Trent stood on his front porch, his arms crossed over his chest as he watched the two women standing before him. He was in his 40s, his dark hair streaked with silver at the temples, his features sharp but kind. There was something in his eyes, something familiar. Madison's throat tightened. He had Walter's eyes. "I'm sorry to show up like this," Madison began, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Madison Jones. This is my daughter, Emily." Daniel studied them carefully, wariness flickering across his face. "I don't understand. Why are you here?" Madison swallowed. This was it. "I was married to Walter Jones." Daniel's expression didn't change. He was still, unmoving, waiting. "Was your father?" A sharp breath left Daniel's lips. For a moment his entire body seemed to tense, his eyes searching Madison's face, as if looking for a lie. "No," he said quietly, shaking his head. "That's not possible." Madison stepped forward. "He never knew about you, Daniel. He thought he had lost Hana in the war. He wrote to her. He tried to find her. But the letters never reached her." Daniel's jaw clenched. His gaze flickered to Emily, then back to Madison. "My mother, she told me about him," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "She said he was an American soldier, but she never knew if he was alive or dead." Madison held out the letters. "He never stopped thinking about you. He didn't know you existed, but he never stopped loving your mother." Daniel stared at the letters for a long moment before reaching out slowly, his fingers trembling as they brushed against the pages. He swallowed hard, blinking rapidly. "I spent my whole life wondering if he even cared," he murmured. Madison's voice was soft. "He did. He just never knew the truth." A long silence stretched between them. Daniel exhaled shakily, his fingers tightening around the letters. Then he whispered, "Where is he now?" Madison's heart clenched. "He passed away a few weeks ago." Daniel shut his eyes, his breath hitching. He lifted a hand to his face, wiping at the tears that had started to fall. Madison hesitated before saying, "I can take you to him." Daniel looked at her, his expression unreadable. But then, slowly, he nodded. And Madison knew this wasn't just about uncovering the past anymore. It was about finding closure for the son Walter never knew he had. The cemetery was quiet, the afternoon sun casting long shadows over the neatly arranged rows of gravestones. A gentle breeze rustled the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of freshly cut grass. Madison stood beside Walter's grave, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if holding herself together. Emily stood beside her, silent, her expression unreadable. A few feet away, Daniel stood still, staring at the headstone that bore the name of a man he had never met but had spent his entire life wondering about. His grip tightened around the letters in his hands. Letters his father had written but never sent. For a long time, no one spoke. Then, slowly, Daniel stepped forward. His movements were hesitant, almost unsure, as if he wasn't certain he had the right to be here. He knelt down, brushing his fingers over the cool stone, tracing the engraved letters, as if committing them to memory. Walter Jones. The name of a stranger. The name of his father. His throat tightened. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, had rehearsed the words he would say if he ever found the man who had been missing from his life. But now, standing here, the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, one that had been kept safe for decades. It was old and faded, the edges worn, but the image was still clear. A young woman, smiling softly, his mother. Daniel swallowed hard and placed the photo carefully at the base of the headstone. His voice, when it finally came, was barely above a whisper. "I found you." A tear slipped down his cheek, but he didn't wipe it away. He just sat there, his hands resting on his knees, letting the weight of the moment settle in. Behind him, Madison felt her own breath hitch. This was what Walter had wanted, even if he had never known it. This was the reunion that had been stolen from him by war, by time, by fate. Emily stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Daniel's shoulder. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away. Instead, he exhaled, long and slow, and nodded. "Did he ever talk about Vietnam?" Daniel asked after a moment, his voice hoarse. Madison hesitated before answering. "Not much," she admitted. "He carried it with him, but he never really shared it. I think it hurt too much." Daniel nodded as if he understood. "My mother never stopped thinking about him," he said quietly. "She tried to move on, but a part of her always held on to the past." Madison blinked away the sting of tears. So did he. The three of them stood there in silence, the past finally meeting the present in the most bittersweet way. Daniel turned back to the grave, his fingers brushing against the letters one last time. "I don't know if you ever thought about me, but I thought about you," he whispered. "And now, at least, I know." Madison reached for his hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. He squeezed back. The past had stolen so much from them. But in this moment, standing together in front of Walter's final resting place, Madison knew that something had been given back. A truth long buried, a connection finally made, and maybe a chance for healing. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Daniel took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and whispered one final word. "Goodbye,